and staff members, and they made a recommendation to our school board to reconfigure both schools into two K-5s based on best instructional practices and some enrollment and capacity issues. So that presentation was made to the school board a few years ago. This fall, our school board asked Superintendent Drew to move forward with the process, and we formed this boundary group. And the boundary group has met several times. You're going to hear about from them and what they've been working on this evening. And at this point, there are several boundary scenarios that they've come up with. And we are here this evening to listen to feedback about what do you think about those scenarios and answer questions, hopefully.
Thanks so much, Leslie. With that out of the way now, we are actually going to take a look at some of those scenarios or the current scenarios. We've asked our business director, Steve Nielsen, to give us that as an overview. Steve.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight. The other thing I wanted to quickly mention before we take a quick review of the scenarios is that the district hired 2 consultants to help facilitate the boundary work group, Rob Saxton and Randy Shield, who are both on this call, and they've helped lead us through this process, and they're former superintendents and leaders in various capacities in Oregon who do this type of work in their retirement, and we really appreciate the wisdom that they've brought and helped leading this group. So thank you for being here tonight as well, Randy and Rob. So I wanted to go ahead and share my screen so we could do a quick review of the scenarios that have been presented and exactly which scenarios are being considered as of right now. The next official work group meeting is next Thursday night if you'd like to join. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, so can everyone sees a map up there? Yes? Okay. Thank you. Get my cursor over here. Okay, so just a review. My role in this has largely been to work with, we have a tool called 5Maps, and we work with a representative back in Illinois, and it's the first time we've used this product. We've used a couple of the other Forecast 5 products for a couple of years now for financial forecasting and just basic school data. But this felt like the right time to be able to use this 5Maps tool. So with the help of Sharon in business services, Sharon Etzel, she helped get all the data to 5Maps and load it into the system. And Debbie and Alex helped get the maps loaded in with our district boundaries for all of our schools. And then we were able to start looking at where people live and how the boundaries work. So this basic entire shell of this map here basically is the in-town boundary as it sits now. And of course, our task was to separate somewhere in there into 2 unique sections, one that would be a Robert Frost section and one that would be a Mark Twain section. Robert Frost has a higher capacity. Right now we're working with a capacity of 450 students. At Mark Twain, we're working with 350. So we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of a 56 to 44% split or somewhere in that neighborhood. One challenge that we had was because of COVID-19, our enrollment district-wide is down 10%. And the data at these schools, obviously, it's quite a bit less. At Mark Twain, for example, there's only 60 of the normally 120 kindergartners attending school this year. So we originally looked at 2021 data and looked at a few configurations, but then we decided to load the 1920 student data as well, just to make sure we had a more normal view of our total enrollment. And the scenarios we're going to show now basically just deal with the students that live inside the boundaries, but keep in mind there are students that live outside the boundaries that go to these schools as well. So what we started with was just a couple of basic things, and this was just some practice really for me, was to just say, well, if we were just to split it based on Highway 214 and Highway 213 based on where the students live, what would that look like? And you can see those clearly didn't work. So 214 had way more students that lived closer to on the Mark Twain side of the line. And then we said, well, what would it look like if it was kind of a 213 split? And you could see it was the same type of thing, too heavily weighted towards Mark Twain. So that was just kind of a trial run. Then we developed two basic scenarios called A and B. And this is what A looked like. And it got the split close, but still probably too many students at Mark Twain. And we knew it was just a first crack at it. And there was a lot of things that could be looked at more closely. Then we went to a scenario B, and this was a little closer to the split we were looking for, but there was still, plenty to be discussed. And so we just, a few of us here at the district just kind of put these together so that the work group could then basically take these and talk about them and start talking about specific areas. And then 6 work group members and I met with our 5 maps representative and looked at areas more closely. And we basically, they were at the controls of the map basically and came up with the scenarios that exist today. So just so you see the scenarios that sit now are scenarios C, D, and E, which were all crafted off of original scenario B, which was basically all of Pioneer and Water Street essentially would go to Robert Frost, which basically that would have to be the case to get Robert Frost enough numbers, because there's so many students that live so closely to Mark Twain. And then scenario B also had most of the Milltown neighborhood. I think it was cut off around Jefferson Street that would go to Mark Twain. And then there was an in-town. It's kind of hard to see with the students here where it was cut off, but I'll show you a zoom shot of that. But this was kind of the original scenario B with the way in-town looked, and it was cut right down Water Street in town. And then as you moved away from town, it moved away from Water Street a little bit here. So you could see this section here went to Mark Twain. In scenarios C, D, and E, in town looks a little bit different, and I'll have some close-ups to show you. So that was kind of where it started. And then the work group, and this view was really a good view because it showed half-mile radius snapshots of from each school. But as far as where we sit today, these are the current scenarios right here on the screen. We have scenario C, and the reason it says modified is because at the January 21st meeting, there were a couple of corrections that were pointed out that needed to be made, and that was just in the meeting that we had with our 5 maps representative. We didn't quite get a couple of things zeroed in quite right, but the things that were changed are, you can see in all of these scenarios, basically the Pioneer area looks exactly the same, and it's different than B slightly, but it's grooved into the way the streets run there and where a possible development will go in, so that all of that would go to Robert Frost. And Dave had a lot of knowledge, Dave Adams, on that area. And then in town, you can see that this cutout looks a little bit different. So what happened with the in town was that where it was down Water Street before, it got cut in a little bit to where more Robert Frost kids would go, or more students in town would go to Robert Frost. So the Water Street was moved over to about somewhere between 3rd and 4th, between Oak and Coons. So that's where that cutout changed. Now on scenario C, you can see that one major change here is that this line up here in the Milltown area was actually moved to the south, so that the Milltown neighborhood would actually go to Robert Frost. whereas in scenarios D and E, the line was moved slightly north from where it was in scenario B, up closer to Webb Lake. And all of those students would go to Mark Twain. Now, the only difference, excuse me, the only difference between scenario D and scenario E, and this was a whole different idea, is that this little blue section up here represents the South Abaquah road and neighborhood. And this section would be cut out of the current Mark Twain Robert Frost boundary area and be placed into the Butte Creek area. So that's what E is. So these two scenarios here at the bottom, they're the same thing. It just, the first one shows without that shaded area that was cut out, and the second one shows what was previously part of the area shaded in the Butte Creek color. So those essentially are the three scenarios as of right now, C, D, and E, that will be discussed tonight and next Thursday at the next work group meeting. This hasn't actually been sent out yet because I was just working on it today, but I updated the student demographic data today for these three scenarios. And you can see how it kind of breaks out. There's essentially 763 students from the 1920 data, 699 of which live in the boundary. And you can see what the breakdown is by scenario. Scenario C, we have a 58, 41 or 42 split. D is a 54, 46 split, and E is a 56, 44 split. And then you can see what the breakdown is of economically disadvantaged special education students and ELL students. Looks like I cut off my print area there. I didn't realize that till just now. I had a breakdown of ethnicity as well. But anyway, I'll get that updated and sent out to the work group here in the next couple of days. So I know that's a lot of information, and hopefully that made sense. A lot of the people on the call have been involved with creating and discussing these scenarios. I'm out of time right now, but I do have a minute or two for any questions or clarifications on what I just presented. All right, well, I'll turn it back over to Derek.
All right, thanks, Steve. And yeah, if folks, if you come up with any questions on any of those scenarios that we've just reviewed over the course of the next several minutes, we will be in about 15 minutes. We'll hit the Q&A portion of the evening, and you'll be free to ask questions about those as well. In just a moment, we're going to turn the time over to Joni Short and Kyle Henderson, who are members of our boundary work group, asked to speak tonight a little bit about the process. Before we do that, we want to just briefly go over a couple of points of logistics surrounding the boundaries, things that we have sort of heard as common questions that we think if we give you some information now may sort of help you to process as we're continue to move forward through the evening. So first of all, we want to establish that none of these things are yet set in stone. We are still in the process. So this is not a situation where major decisions have been made in terms of the way things absolutely will work. The thing we can tell you for sure, because this was already decided, is that both Mark Twain and Robert Frost will be K-5 schools next year. But in terms of exactly where the boundary is, or the exact pieces of logistics that I'm about to sort of talk about, these are plans, and they are processes that we are moving toward putting into place as we move forward. But again, these are not set in stone. We want to share these things so that you are aware, just with full transparency, these things have been talked about in the work group meetings, and they're a major component of what this process will likely look like. So with that said, the first thing that we want to talk about is that one of the things that has come out as being very important is the potential for family choice. And family choice may be represented in a couple of different ways. And I want to give you two examples. The first, and we talked about this in our town hall yesterday evening with the South Abequa family specifically, is that the plan would be that if the work group were to ultimately decide to recommend boundary E, which moves that South Abequa area from the in-town schools boundary out to Butte Creek, that there would be a family choice process wherein students who currently attend the in-town schools could continue along that path or move out to Butte Creek when the boundary does. And that essentially drawing that boundary out to Butte Creek would mean that new students in the future would attend Butte Creek, but that families already in the process through the in-town schools would have the choice to continue through Mark Twain, Robert Frost, and then Silverton Middle School before ultimately graduating from Silverton High School. So that would be one example of the family choice. Another area we've talked about is with current Robert Frost fourth graders. So one of the driving reasons behind the reconfiguration to a pair of K-5 schools is because of the educational downsides to swapping schools, especially in the younger grades. What we don't want to do is set up our students who have only recently moved to Robert Frost to then shift them back potentially to Mark Twain just for that 1 year in fifth grade. And again, this is something that's being discussed, is the opportunity to maybe provide that family choice there to allow families to opt into remaining at Robert Frost for that fifth grade year for this coming school year. So we want to sort of establish that now. Finally, plans for busing and other pieces of logistics like that are still being established. However, things like busing out in the South Abequa area to Butte Creek would become available if scenario E was ultimately the one that was selected. Leslie, were there any other logistic pieces we want to make sure we hit before we turn the time over to Joni and Kyle?
Just real quick, with the busing, if we went that direction, if the boundary group chose that, it would, scenario E, the South Abequa families would have a choice of continuing in town through 8th grade or to Butte Creek. And so those families would have transportation either direction if that was the boundary that was chosen.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Okay, so with that said, we are happy to have, we actually have quite a few members of our boundary work group here tonight, but we did ask ahead of time for Mr. Kyle Henderson and Mrs. Joni Short to speak to us this evening. And their presentation is just going to be sort of around the process and thinking to this point of the advisory work group. So we'll turn the time over to them.
Joni, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I'll just say I've been part of this process for a while. I started on the original committee that Leslie talked about, where we were just really trying to decide, was K-5 the right thing? So I've been invested in this for a while. I am a teacher at Mark Twain, and I teach first grade. The couple of things that I wrote down was just to talk about that what I heard at the beginning of this work group from Scott Drew was that he really wanted this process to be transparent. So we wanted transparency. And I feel like that's really what we're doing here with these town halls, the town hall yesterday and the town hall today. By our schedule, we would have already have had our final meeting, I believe, but we really felt like it was important to be transparent about all of the scenarios that were on the table and to really get community input. So I just want to say thank you, because I feel like that process has been really honored, and I appreciate it. So I hope that the community feels that as well. And then the other thing I guess I kind of covered both of them. It's just that we added additional meetings beyond what we originally thought of, even going back to what Steve talked about, where he came with some scenarios for us to look at, but then they invited the work group to come back and make some additional changes and see where we could kind of refine those scenarios a little bit more. So again, just with that transparency and really wanting to make sure the whole process was followed through, I think that has been really great and I've appreciated it. Kyle, do you want to talk?
Yeah, I'm Kyle Henderson. I'm a 4th grade teacher at Robert Frost. I too was previously on the committee to recommend 2 K-5 schools in our community. When I was on that committee, my biggest concern the whole time was, where do you set the boundary? You know, that is a huge concern. And it was hard for me to wrap my head around recommending something without having a boundary set. But with that, I got onto this committee, and when we first started focusing on priorities that we as a committee or work group, I guess we are called, the priorities for setting the boundaries. So for example, like equity, class sizes, safety, and so on and so forth. And then after that, we asked for feedback from community about their priorities in setting boundaries. And then even after that, we, with focusing on those priorities set by the work group and the community, we use that program that Steve was talking about, 5 maps, to help set the boundary lines, moving them around to make sure those class sizes would be equal, there would be equitable schools, and distances would be safe for kids to walk, and so on and so forth. And now we're here in this waiting process to hear more back from our community about our recommendations as a work group. So that's kind of the process that we've been on. And I just have also appreciated the transparency and trying to get as much community feedback on this process. I don't know if I've been on a committee that has focused so much on the community as this one. So set from the beginning, just that transparency has been huge.
Great, thank you, Kyle and Joni. I'm so sorry. Okay, so with that, we have reached the question and answer portion of the meeting. What we're going to ask is that if you would like to participate, that you, I'm going to say this, and it does not appear that we have this feature turned on right now. So we'll call an audible and just say, if you'd like to participate, if you could just type in chat that that is the case, and we will call on people one at a time. We recognize that many of us here this evening are district employees. Like many of you, as a district employee myself, I also have children who attend schools in town. And if you are here in that role as a parent and you have questions or would like to provide feedback, we invite you to do that. So at this time, the floor is open. We'll watch the chat room for people to sort of pop in that they have something they'd like to say or a question they'd like to ask, and we will address those as they come in. Yes, Jenny Matska, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I haven't been on a lot of these meets, so I wasn't sure if it maybe has been already addressed, but I was just wondering what future residential development did you include in the plans, or is this set on the current future residence development? I was thinking of the West Side expansion, of course, the most.
Sure, no, that's a great question. And yeah, so we've been very fortunate. The work group did have the opportunity to look at quite a few demographics and growth reports. There was a demographic study done by Portland State University just a few years ago. Mayor Palmer has been involved in the process in several of our work groups. And so while I don't want to sort of freestyle and try and come up with a list off the top of my head of which things specifically, I will say that if you take a look at the K-5 boundary process and reconfiguration page of the district website, every document that has been used in the work group is available to view there, and you can sort of take a look at that. You can also look at the YouTube videos, so you can sort of see the way they were talked about. The other thing that I'll sort of address, because I think I also heard you ask, is are we thinking about the future, or is the work group thinking about the future as we move forward? And I would say that that's absolutely the case. As a matter of fact, I believe that was one of the driving forces behind. I shouldn't say it's the driving force, but it certainly is one of the reasons behind the proposal for scenario E, was that left some room for in-town growth as well. So
Okay, and then just a follow-up question.
yeah, go for it.
Did you have one? Whatever.
Peter,
Let's
Jen
be together.
Zasman. Yeah, I guess the question, and it could be answered, the Pioneer, I was going to look at that map, the Pioneer subdivision. I thought you said that was going to Robert Frost. Is that correct?
From the number of heads I see nodding, I'm going to go with yes.
Yes, and that was, because I guess when I heard that, and I know that you've been working with the city and getting that data, but with the expansion at Pioneer, and then the development that's going to the west of Robert Frost and the west side expansion plan, but there's about a 250 resident unit approved plan just to the west of Robert Frost. It just, that's a massive swath of future development. And that's why I asked that. It just seems like that's a good chunk of the already approved on the list development. So you're kind of already pushing that model in 5 years into the future. So that's just why I asked. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so those issues that you're talking about have certainly been discussed within the work group. Steve, you have been, Steve Nielsen, sort of a part of the mapping process a little more frequently than I have. Do you want to maybe speak to those developments in particular, or the way that those have sort of been thought about?
Well, Jason from the city gave a really thorough presentation with his mapping tool, and including how long some of those developments will take, in terms of time frames. So I would encourage to watch the video of that meeting. It was about a 10 or 15 minute presentation. You're right, Peter. There's going to be two major developments that would impact the Robert Frost area, but that's also kind of a crossover into our long-range facility planning process as well. One of the, just in the last meeting, we're really zeroing down in on where the priorities are. And I know in town, when you look at size of the buildings, educational adequacy, that type of thing, it was one of the recommendations with the planners we're working with, is that either Mark Twain or Robert Frost would need 1 or 2 additional classrooms built over the next 5 to 10 years, and so that would help that for sure. I mean, there obviously hasn't been any decisions made, but that was just something that was coming out from the 5 to 10 year growth outlook.
And I'm not speaking on behalf. I'm on the planning commission, so that's why I get to see the reviews and all that. And so just looking ahead, it's a 6 year. I mean, K-5, 6 years.
Yeah.
And our 6 year plan has a substantial development. So I put that in there for you to. I mean, it might be the best plan you have now, but it's going to be modified by the time that kindergartner is getting ready to head out, because that is a 6 to 8 year plan for 800 units. So.
Right, and it was also recognized.
It's a growing process.
It was also recognized that in 5 years the boundary line might have to be adjusted.
Well, yeah, that's what I was getting at. Is the boundary is going to be fluctuating, but that's.
So
that's
just to add in, Rob Saxton here. One of the interesting things that the University of Portland School of Demographics does is take a look at how many students typically come from different kinds of housing. Like how many kids can you expect in a single family home? How many can you expect in a duplex or a multiple family dwelling and that kind of thing. And so, those figures have been calculated into this with the boundary suggestions, with the new growth that would come along. And it looks like, things are in pretty good shape 5 to 10 years out based on C, D, or E likely, although E, I think, creates some additional room at Mark Twain that people are concerned it would be needed or could possibly be needed sooner than that. So.
Yeah, and I understand that some of that housing actually to the west of Robert Frost is going to be tailored more towards senior, maybe a non-child, non-dependent at home housing kind of configurations. But anyways, I just wanted to know what that was. So thank you.
Jenny just made the face that I've been making all night every time I have to hit the mute button, which is, I hope they didn't hear my children screaming. Thank you, though. Yes, Jenny and Peter, thank you for your questions. And Steve and Rob, thank you for your input. So others, I do see, for those who don't have the chat, I know Zoom can be sort of monolithic when you look at it, but there is a chat button down toward the bottom of your screen. It may be off to the right side, depending on which version you're running or what sort of device you're on. I'd encourage you to open up the chat, and if you have any questions or comments you'd like to offer, to just mention there, and we'll call on you and invite you to speak. Also, thank you to Joni, who did provide a link directly to the K5 reconfiguration page on the website. That's very helpful. And then also to Courtney and also Eliza, who are both providing some additional context for sort of the discussion that was just occurring. So with that said, any other questions? What other questions do we have? Or comments, I should say.
I don't know if this is something that people would be willing to share, but I just wondered what the input was from the South Avoca residents and what their feelings were on that option and how that kind of specific town hall went last night.
Sure, yeah. So great question, Therese. I would say that it would be fair to call it sparsely attended. The video will go up by Tuesday of next week. We're actually shooting for tomorrow, but I just have to tell you that it could be Tuesday of next week. We did answer some questions, and there were some concerns about sort of why make the change out, if students have sort of always gone to in-town schools, why the need for Butte Creek. And then we heard a lot of great comments talking about how, families who had children attend both Butte Creek and the in-town sort of path had wonderful experiences in both. And so we spent a bit of time explaining the logistical piece that we sort of talked about earlier in terms of that family choice model, and that would very likely be in place if that was the way that the work group decided to go. And that was, I would say, the bulk of that meeting. Otherwise, similar content to what you're seeing here tonight. Any other questions or comments? The floor is yours, and so feel free to, if you think of something, like I said, go ahead and unmute if no one else is talking, and you can just sort of popcorn in, or you can utilize the chat feature.
Well, I guess just out of curiosity and interest, how far out does that line go towards Webb Lake? I know you were talking about that was extended north, just because I live out in that area and I know I have some students that live close.
There's some close-ups, you know, on the link on the website. I'd see if I could find it here, the one that was discussed. Let's see here. If I could find it. Yeah, so it looks like it's just north of Lincoln Street Park there. I mean, it pretty much goes right up to the lake there on that right corner.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit too, Steve, if it helps her a little bit, just from like thinking of access. Anybody who's in that Webb Lake neighborhood, that would not be part of that. So it really was meant to include everyone that's part of Milltown and make sure that it's stretched to all of Milltown. The only way to do that was to put it a little bit behind the homes, if that makes sense, in 5 maps. But it's really Milltown is the neighborhood that's captured there. The Webb Lake neighborhood would all be separate. It would be Robert Frost, I guess, is what it would be.
Yeah, so I'm gonna thank you very much, Joni. I'm
Yeah.
just gonna share my screen again here. Get my mouse back over there. So yeah, hopefully you could see that there. This 8-page slide deck, I believe, is on that K5 boundary workgroup section on the website. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So you'll be able to look at these on your own as well. But this kind of gives some close-up shots that I didn't show on my previous guys, just didn't have time. But like here's the Pioneer area and exactly where kind of that's cut out, and here's the in-town piece where it's cut up to about 3rd or 4th there between Oak and Coons. And then this is scenario C, where the line comes south of just south of Whittier there, Terrace, on scenario C. Again, that's C, and here's that D and E here. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but you could also call this up on the website.
So is part of Jefferson Street Robert Frost and part of it Mark Twain?
Jefferson is right here. Can you see that? Okay, yeah. So yes, so Jefferson between 1st and 2nd would be Robert Frost. Is that correct? Yeah. Now, most of this section here are the businesses. There's some houses in here, though, I believe.
And I would just say that this view sometimes is deceptive because we have live pins of real students in the actual software. And so to us, it's easy to see where students are living and residents are, whereas this doesn't have that. So that's harder to see. So you got to actually compare it to Google Maps and see, okay, well, what business is there? So I know that's not where people are living.
Yeah, so for some of these close-up shots, I elected to keep the pins and cluster views off just because then it covered up the lines. So that was just a choice I had to make for this particular slide deck.
One question we've received via the chat, and I'm just going to preface this before I sort of throw this out there back to you here, Steve, is that when it comes to specific questions about why a boundary may have been drawn in one way or another, one thing we sort of want to avoid is giving a concrete answer on behalf of the work group, because we don't have all work group members here tonight. And so one of the things that we might do if we don't sort of have an obvious answer, as in like, oh, well, you asked that question and it was talked about, and so let us tell you why that decision was made, is we might say, that's a great question. We will take that back with us to next week's meeting of the full boundary work group and then allow them to sort of discuss. And we invite anybody here who's interested to come to that meeting. It is also held in this format on Zoom. And during that meeting, there is also a time for public comment. So you could also share the question during that time. With that said, we do want to make sure that we are addressing the questions that we can tonight. So if this was discussed, Steve, one question we had is why not remove Edison to one of the outer schools rather than keeping it at Robert Frost? I guess one thing I should sort of say first is, especially if you go back and watch, in particular, the first several meetings of the boundary work group, which again are all available on YouTube, you'll find that one of the components of sort of this process that was discussed was that sort of to the extent possible, trying to keep the boundaries drawn only affecting the Mark Twain and Robert Frost boundaries, but that if necessary to go out and sort of draw boundaries that made the most sense, then this boundary process could involve sort of minor reconfigurations to some of the outlying schools. And so you see that, of the several, based on the letters in the alphabet, I believe the 5 boundaries that were presented from A to E, only one of those involved kind of touching the boundaries of one of the out-of-town schools. So with that said, that could be a component. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I did want to mention that just for those who have gone back and watched or who have otherwise participated in this process. Steve, can you speak to whether or not Edison specifically was talked about, or if this is something that we can just take back next week?
I don't recall that coming up, no.
Okay. So yeah, as I said, because we don't have the full work group here tonight, and because this is a work group process, rather than something that the district is sort of working through from the top down, we will take that question back as a piece of feedback to the work group and allow them to address that during their next regular meeting, which is scheduled for the 11th of this month. Thank you for your question. We do have 5 more minutes scheduled for Q&A this evening and about 10 minutes left in the meeting. So I'd invite any other questions or comments that you'd like to share with the work group. Please go ahead and do so, whether via chat or by unmuting and just popping in at this point. One of my great joys as someone who has worked in education for almost 15 years and who doesn't get to see kids very often anymore other than my own is whenever I see somebody's child pop their head in front of a Zoom call and then pop back out when they realize that the camera is on a Zoom meeting. It always makes me smile. We'll give it just another minute or two here for last call for questions or comments, if there are any, before we sort of move to our wrap up for this evening. Jenny Madska in chat said, thanks for all your work. And I'm going to agree with that for the members of our work group. It's been a really phenomenal process to see these folks come in and volunteer their time in the evenings. Many times in the past several months in order to make sure that we get this right, and that it's something that is truly a process that comes from the community rather than something that comes from the top down in the district. So it's been wonderful having all their input and spending the time with them these evenings. Okay, well, I will put in one final reminder for the meeting on the 11th, which is the next meeting of the boundary work group. I'm going to make sure I get the time exactly right because I would hate to give you bad information. So our next meeting of the boundary work group will be on the 11th from 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. That is next Thursday evening. The information will be sent out again through Parent Square. It will be posted on the district's Facebook page and website. So we encourage you, if you have an interest in this process, to come in and observe. There is a time for public comment scheduled in each of these meetings, and we would love to have you there, and we would love to hear your comments. The more comments we hear, the more feedback we get, the better this process ultimately is. So we would love to have you there. With that said, Mr. Drew, Scott, do you have anything you sort of want to say here at the end of the meeting?
No, I just want to say thank you for coming. It's really important that the work group hear from you and to give us a chance to explain where we are in the process, and just really nice to take that feedback in and so the work group can do their work, and they'll next steps would be to see what they come up with by way of a recommendation. And so thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Thanks for spending the time with us tonight.